At any given moment in my house, you're almost always guaranteed to walk into some kind of screaming toddler. Those screams are nearly always the result of one of about three reasons: happy toddler screams, the screams of Team Spidey swearing off against the Green Goblin, or angry screams because in the midst of fighting that good fight, one of my small superheroes has somehow come to upset the other. So it's probably not all that surprising then that we talk about the word sorry and what an apology means in my house quite a lot. We talk about how meaningful it can be when you speak to people and you give them a heartfelt and genuine apology. And we also talk a lot about how just saying sorry in a way that indicates that you're anything but sorry is perhaps even more hurtful than saying nothing at all. And almost always this conversation then veers into the subtopic of questioning whether we have harmed someone intentionally or by mistake. And that's probably the hardest of the conversations for my tiny superheroes to grasp. But it's not altogether surprising because I think that's one of the aspects that making amends is most difficult with, for people to fully comprehend what it means to say we're sorry and how to mean it, even when it's intentional or unintentional. There's a certain degree of clarity if you harm someone unintentionally. Sometimes in those moments, you don't even realize that you've done harm until somebody brings it to your attention. What's rather less clear, though, is how you make amends if you're aware that by doing something, you will likely cause harm, and you choose to do it anyway. As a toddler, this might mean taking a toy away from your brother. I've had no experience with that, even though you know it will make him upset. All things considered, for anyone who's not 2 or 4 years old, the stakes are relatively low in a scenario like that. But put it into the context of real problems that cause real harm to real people, sometimes the very essence of our humanity is at stake. Our Torah portion this week, the first book of Leviticus, Vayikra, asks us to confront these questions head on. Now remember, the Torah in the book of Leviticus in particular asks questions and offers solutions in the context of sacrificial framework of temple sacrifice. Chapter 4 begins by God asking Moses to speak to the Israelite people and say, when a person unwittingly incurs guilt in regard to any of Adonai's commandments about the things not to be done and does one of them. In verse 3, it speaks of a priest. It says, Im hakonhem hamashiach yechata, if a priest incurs guilt, then he needs to offer an unblemished bull as a sacrifice. And it goes into all of that it entails. And then in verse 13, we read, Ve'im kol adat Yisrael, if the community leadership, and by extension the entire congregation errs, they also have to offer a bull of the herd to make amends. And in both cases, the Hebrew, the word im is used, which means if. If a priest incurs guilt, if a congregation makes an error. But if you look at verse 22, though, it speaks of a chieftain, which sometimes means a tribal leader, like we see in the book of Numbers, and sometimes, like in the book of Ezekiel, it means a king. But both, regardless of what it's signifying somebody in leadership. Here, in verse 22, it says, Asher nasi yechata, in case it is a chieftain. Not if it is a chieftain, but in the case of. Now, some of our commentators aren't at all bothered by the difference in language, but others wonder if it points to something fairly significant, because after all, they say nothing in the Torah is an accident. Does the turn of phrase that is different than all of the rest that come before, the word im, indicate not a question of if a leader will sin, but rather a certainty that they will sin? And instead of hoping that we'll somehow figure out what to do in those moments of pain and fear and uncertainty that always come when a grave error in judgment has been made, the Torah proactively offers a framework that says, when this happens, and it will, this is how you will make amends. This is how you will do the work of teshuvah. Now, I find this actually tremendously comforting. The notion that Torah doesn't expect any of us, even our most esteemed leaders, to be perfect, and instead offers us pathways towards teshuvah if and when we fail, helps to normalize being imperfect and the realization that sometimes we hurt each other and sometimes we fail. But so long as we're willing to engage in true and meaningful reconciliation and teshuvah, there are legitimate paths forward. Now, I need to put a caveat on this to say that this piece of Torah does not cover any and all errors. There are errors in conduct and judgment so grievous and so painful and so traumatic that leaders cannot be allowed to remain in positions of leadership and influence. But these are not the leaders that I'm talking about tonight. Rabbi Shai Held teaches that Judaism insists that how leaders respond to their own failures really matters. Do they deny them, cover them up, cast blame elsewhere? Or do they own up to their misdeeds, hold themselves accountable, and repent? The path fallen leaders choose, the sages insist, has vast implications not only for the leaders themselves, but also for the entire society that they lead. So how do our leaders, and by extension our institutions, do this work? How do they make amends to real people for very real pain that they've caused? Does the answer change if leadership knew about a problem but chose not to do anything about it? And how do you rebuild trust in people and in institutions that participate in the act of covering up a problem or sweeping it under the rug? About 2 years ago, some of you might remember hearing me speak about my smicha, my ordination document. I stood right here on the bima and showed you and pointed out the difference between my smicha and the smicha that is bestowed to my male colleagues. I shared with you that while the English title is the same, they all say rabbi, the Hebrew is different. And it's the words that are the sacred tie that each rabbi is participating in an unbroken chain of traditions to the rabbis that came before them. My male colleague's smachot reads, Morenu Harav, our teacher, the rabbi. My smicha reads Rav Umara, rabbi and teacher. It's very subtle, but it is a distinct difference. And it was Mary Zamor, Rabbi Mary Zamor, who is the executive director of the Women's Rabbinic Network, and some of you may remember was our scholar not this past November, but last November. She found the discrepancy and she raised the issue with HUC-JIR, Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. She sent an email in 2012, but it wasn't until November of 2015 that a faculty task force was convened to correct the gender inequality. Beginning 2016, ordainees were given the opportunity to determine what title would appear on their smicha. But it wasn't until 2 years ago, in 2022, that the majority of the rabbinic world learned about the gender disparity in our ordination documents as it came to light with other serious counts of discrimination and abuse within the walls of our House of Learning. You might remember that I shared with you my internal struggle of what it meant to learn that my title of rabbi, something that I worked hard for and that I earned through years of study, does not carry with it the same symbolic and historical weight of my male colleagues, and it was devastating to me. How could it be that the egalitarian, liberal, progressive institution that I chose to be ordained at took nearly 50 years to confront this? That the movement that trains leaders to fight for equality and representation in every arena somehow chose to perpetuate gender bias within the sacred halls of learning and within the sacred ritual of ordination itself is deeply painful. And it's a symptom of the underlying gender biases that still plague our liberal, egalitarian Jewish world. In March of 2022, just weeks after this ethics report came out, though, HUC-JIR's Teshuvah Working Group was convened to help formulate a meaningful approach to repentance and reconciliation consistent with the healing needs of those impacted by misconduct. The group met and worked consistently for an entire year, and then they formally issued their recommendations to the College Institute of March of 2023. Among the recommendations were avenues for how true teshuvah could be made to rabbis like me, who had unknowingly been issued a gender-specific title on their smicha. One option they offered was to affix a statement adjacent to the smicha, which details the inequitable Hebrew language on the title. Another was to participate in reaffirming ordination ceremonies through blessing and ordination under the auspices of an entirely new ceremony. And the final option is to receive a new smicha that provides the title of choice to each recipient. Any alumni seeking reissued documents get to choose between one of three options, all of which are now rooted in the sacred title that's been handed down, Morenu Harav, and that places both words in the masculine. Moratenu Harav gives folks the option of making the word for teacher feminine in Hebrew, while retaining the title Rav for rabbi. And Moratenu Harabah, a title that some colleagues, especially those in Israel, choose, make both words feminine. I'll admit, when I was first presented with all of these options, I struggled. While I was hurt and angry about the gender inequity in my title, my smicha itself is precious to me. It represents the culmination of learning and a time in my life that was deeply meaningful. And looking at it takes me back to the joy and the pride of the moment that it was placed into my hand by my beloved teacher, and it's affixed with signatures of professors whose learning I have cherished, and some of whom who are no longer with us. How could I replace it? And how could I not replace it? But then I realized, like most things in life, the choice doesn't have to be binary. It doesn't have to be either or. It can be both and. I both love my smicha, and I'm also deeply troubled by it. I can keep it on my wall and also receive a second one, to place alongside it to tell the story of my history, of our history. The story of how even the best teachers in the greatest institutions can and do make mistakes that cause deep and abiding pain. And even in those moments, there do exist pathways to make amends, because true and deep teshuvah does have the power to make what is broken whole once more. I'm proud to be an alumna of HUC-JIR. I'm proud that my trust was not displaced, and that the leadership of my place of learning, the place that taught me what it means to go out into the world and be a rabbi, is not only teaching words of Torah, but walking the path of Torah too. I look forward to receiving my new smicha soon, the title of which I chose Moratenu Harav, to have a mixture of the feminine and the masculine, to have the title of Rav be consistent with rabbis who came before me. And I look forward to sharing that moment with all of you who continue to walk this path with me. Shabbat Shalom.